What's up, gamers? Welcome back to 180 MTG. My name is Ryan Overturf, and this week I'm going to be talking about color imbalance and restriction in cube design. I guess the best way to define this is to start by talking about color balance and then these other concepts as a negation of that. So, color balance is pretty simple. It just means that every color would have the same representation by volume of cards in a given cube. And this was, for a long time, considered quote unquote conventional wisdom. This was how early articles about cube tended to be written. They would say if you want to build a cube, you do this: get like 52 white cards, 52 blue cards, 52 black cards, 52 red cards, 52 green cards, 50 gold cards, 50 colorless cards, 50 lands. Add that together, it's 360, and just having those even ratios, I think that just for approachability is a lot of why this was sold in the first place. And if you want every color to be equally draftable and playable in an environment, it does make some logical sense to start by having every color have an equal representation. And this is an aspect of my original recipe Tubert design that's something that I thought would be a useful baseline, with that being a goal to have every color be equally playable. But as you get more in the weeds in cube design, or maybe even when your first cube, you just have more red cards than green cards than you like. Understandable problem to have, and you just have like a couple extra cards of one particular color. It doesn't really come up. It's hard to feel that as a drafter. If you want to talk about something being perfectly balanced abstractly, something you could never really experience as a human playing the environment, even though you might have your thoughts on how good the balance is, it's something where a couple cards being different here or there, being a little bit imbalanced, it's totally fine, something you can definitely do. So any imbalance does refer to breaking that, but if you're just like one or two cards off, it's not really necessarily worth talking about as an imbalance. When I talk about color imbalances, I mean more having a dramatic shift, where some of the colors are way more represented or way less represented by some significant amount. And I'll get into that a little bit more, some examples of that. But first, really quickly, want to define a color restriction, which is just fully saying we are excluding some of the five colors of magic, or all of the five colors of magic. Dan Schneider's Devoid Cube. It does have some colored pips, but everything at least has devoids. So there's no spells that have colors. So you can fully take all of the colored aspect out of magic entirely. That's the most extreme colored restriction. But often the examples of color restriction is just like excluding one, two, three, or four of the colors of magic. That's going to be a little bit more common. But if you are so inclined, you can maintain a cube fully without using the colors of magic. But today I'm going to be talking about color imbalances and or restrictions in cube. So first, let's talk a little bit about why you would want to do this. The most basic reason is just as a gimmick. One of the first cubes I ever remember playing was a mono blue cube. Why was it mono blue? Because it was a thing to do. This was in the early 2010s, so cube at that time tended to be a lot more streamlined. So I was really excited just to play a cube that was different from the typical like vintage or legacy, just all good cards cubes. And this was a power maxing kind of mono blue cube. So it's all blue cards and then like artifacts and lands. And then the power disparity in the cube was pretty funny because it was powered. There was Black Lotus, Ancestral Recall, Time Walk, and there's a lot of really powerful artifact stuff like Tolarian Academy. And then it also had some funny, like, there was some stuff that was like funny but definitely worked. Like Merfolk as a creature type was supported. I believe that that could have been competitive, and if you did that today, that could definitely be competitive in a mono blue cube. And then there was some really silly stuff like sea monsters, like cards with island home, creatures that you had to sacrifice if you didn't control an island. The punchline is, of course, you're going to control an island. That stuff was pretty weak, even if you go back, almost 15 years. But for the most part, yeah, given that power imbalance, if you just want to say this is a cube that has all green cards, for example, a gimmick, just like it's all green cards because I wanted to see what it would look like. Totally valid reason. I mean, just like when you're doing color balance, if you have a couple extra white cards, it'll probably be fine. If the reason you're doing a specific thing with your cube is because it seemed like a fun thing to do, really, there's no better reason to do it. An extension of that is you might color restrict or imbalance your cube to support a gimmick. So both an example of similar cubes that fully restricted or imbalanced the same color playing in the same space. In my artifact Tubert, currently it is now color balanced, but that's Largely due to a few newer cards, specifically in green. Green is the color that does the least to support artifact synergies. When you are putting a lot of green cards in Artifact Cube, you kind of invariably start running into just like adding more and more cards that destroy artifacts. Green takes a controlling role, which is kind of cool, but every other color is really like giving you synergies and fun things to do with your artifacts. And it gets to a point, at least for me, when you can only stand so many oxidizes. So for a while, I had half as many green cards as the other colors because I still wanted some stuff. I wanted hardened scales, and I wanted ancient stirrings. Those are like constructed staples that really play in the Arcbound Ravager space. But then when David McDarby put an artifact cube on Magic Online, those cubes are much larger, 3 times the size of Tubert to a 540 card cube on Magic Online. When he did artifacts for Magic Online, he just didn't have any green cards. It was only cards are going to synergize. He decided this is too many shatters. We want people to be building things that are fun and proactive. And when one or more of the colors don't play in the space that you're designing for, it makes sense to have fewer cards of those colors, or just to remove them from the environment entirely. If they're not serving your end goal, then you just don't need to play with them. It's that easy. And finally, you can restrict or imbalance colors for mechanical or game balance reasons. I think the most famous example of this is when the Magic Online Vintage Cube decided we're just going to have more blue cards than the other colors because nobody wants to pass an Ancestral Recall or Time Walk. So we just want to enable you to play blue as often as people want to play blue. So more blue cards if you say blue is the strongest color, or there's all these appealing cards that you never want to pass in blue. You can just give players higher access to blue cards by volume so they don't really have to pass those cards as much. And if they want to be in blue, they can play in blue. And that kind of massages the historical imbalance of individually powerful cards. Of course, today there's a lot more attention on Boros, but in my heart of hearts and in the most powerful cubes, I still believe that it's good to have more blue cards and that blue is the strongest color in Powered Cube. Well, that's not today's topic. Another example of like a mechanical or balance reason to have a color imbalance many years ago, there was a local cube I remember that had more green cards than other colors. And that's because at the time, the green was so much creatures that were like okay, and you would have your mana accelerants and whatever, and you could have like a mana ramp deck, but it was so one note and you were so much more vulnerable to creature removal. So just having more green cards, it kind of forced players to play green a little bit more. And when there's less of the power outliers in other colors, you like trim some of that stuff and you just add more green cards so players just are incentivized to play the green decks that get there on volume. It's a heavy-handed way to do it, but it's certainly something that you can explore. That was just like a good cards cube, and that was so many years ago. There's so many more cards now, and we are able to do so many more creative and explore cubes in unique spaces. So you wouldn't necessarily do something like that for a high-powered cube, but it's a good note to be aware of when you're exploring a more niche space, like that example of an artifact cube. Color imbalance was really useful there. If you're playing with like enchantments, you might go heavier on green and white and lower on blue and red, for example. And of course, I have to mention my Grixis Cube. This is something that I designed again many years ago, and at the time, I liked playing a lot of really high powered cubes. Kind of the vision for that cube is it was the most powerful stuff that was just short of the Power 9. So you could play with like Mox Diamond and Grim Monolith, but I wouldn't have Black Lotus and Ancestral Recall. But the higher power level you got, really back then, green and white were so difficult to make work. And they can really have some problems still today, but they are much more fleshed out. There's a lot more you can do with green and white and powered cubes. So at the time that I did that, I didn't use green or white cards, specifically because I was trying to design a very high powered format, and those colors just weren't synergizing with the high power stuff I was trying to play with, and they didn't really contribute to the environment. It was like Boros was an aggressive color pair, but you could do everything that Boros does just by being mono red. I didn't really see much reason to be mono white in a cube that was trying to push Reanimator and Storm and Tolarian Academy. And even today, I've been having trouble trying to make green and white work in a 180 card powered cube. It's so difficult to make those colors work when you're not getting there kind of on volume, when you can lean into green doing lands matter or some different power levels or distributions where Gaia's Cradle's more of a player or where Nadu is more appealing. And white is kind of tough given that you have the really strong Boros stuff, but then you specifically have to be red and white to play Boros, and you just have to care about a lot more things, where like a mono blue drafter is kind of on easy street, taking whatever fast mana and card draw comes their way and just going off with Plarian Academy without having to sweat finding plateau and making sure that their mana curve really works because you just have a bunch of historical power outliers. So that's been tough to crack. So certainly in the 180 card space, the Grixis Power Cube, that's where I'm at with that. But when I look at a larger cube, I'm thinking a lot more of the positive expressions of heavily sampling blue, black, and red cards, and I'm less thinking about specifically wanting to eschew white and green. There's a lot you can do when you're getting up to a 360 or a 540 card powered cube. So when I look at that smaller space, there's still some reasons why when you're on a very tight list, you're going to heavily favor certainly blue in high power environments. But there's more going on where I think now, when I think about an 8-player cube environment of the Grixis Cube today, I'm way more treating it as just a straight gimmick. It's less we're not playing with green and white cards, it's more we are playing with blue, black, and red cards because blue, black, and red cards are sweet. So at this point, I've played with a lot of different color imbalance or restricted cubes, and I have a lot of thoughts on the space that opens up. If we're talking about the blue, black, and red cards are sweet, what are the consequences of color restrictions, and what does that allow us to do in cube design? So let's talk about what a color restriction does conceptually, and then how we can explore that space in our own designs. I think that this stuff is a little bit more self-evident for a color imbalance because if you just end up with more cards of a particular color, you likely already have goals in mind. But when you just take a cube and you say, I'm not going to have any white cards, then when you want to build your cube, you suddenly kind of have a fundamental building block that's usually available to a 5-color cube. It's just not there. When you eliminate one of the colors, immediately you don't have any gold color pairs or combinations involving that color. You don't have any monocolor cards, of course, and you don't have any needs for lands that are going to fix mana of that color. So essentially what that means is you have more space. Each individual column that remains in your cube can do more things. All of your monocolors, all of your 2 or more color combinations, your colorless column gets longer, potentially. Your land column does open up and asks to be designed differently. So you just kind of have more room for more stuff. So let's talk about just the different categories of what that stuff is and what you can do. First and foremost, you have more room for gold cards. If you feature multiple colors, if you color restrict down to just one color, then that's not really true. But if you have 2 to 4 colors, then you can just add more gold cards. That's definitely a space that you can play in if you're color restricting. And if you have a lot of different archetypes and themes you want to explore, if you want to have 2 very different flavors of one color pair, if you want to have Azorius Flash and Azorius Control, you can support both of those archetypes with just more gold cards because it's less restricting to have a card be blue-white if there's only 4 different colors. If there's only 3 different colors, then there's actually only 2 different 2-color combinations. So players are very likely to play Azorius in a band cube, or if you are playing all 3 colors in a band cube, then you have plenty of room for Azorius gold cards. You can add even a couple more archetypes centered in that pair. You could have Blink seated in Azorius. You just get to do more freely with any color combination. You can just put in more gold cards because they are less restricting in these color restricted environments. So it does open up the space for more of those multicolor archetypes in the same color combination, which is a direct consequence of the average player being able to cast more of these spells in their draft pool on average. When there's 3 colors instead of 5, just way more of the cards you draft are going to be castable. So you can do more things that are more specific. Gold cards being an example of something that can be pretty restrictive. If you're drafting a 3-color deck and a 5-color cube, there's 2 full colors that you're not going to be able to cast spells from, and any gold combination featuring those colors is going to be a non-starter for you too. If you're a 2-color deck, that's even more restrictive. But if you're a 2-color deck in a 3-color environment, you can play most of the cards in that cube. So you can definitely go heavier on gold cards without having to do anything very fancy if you are eschewing one or more of the colors of Magic from your cube. On a very similar note, there's going to be more room in a color-restricted environment for heavily pipped cards, cards that cost a lot of 1 color in mana. Something that costs blue, blue, blue is a lot more appealing in a 3-color environment than in a 5-color environment. It's just easier to draft monocolor just on math. The problem with drafting monocolor in an 8-player draft in a 5-color cube is that there's 5 different colors and there's 8 drafters. There's not enough. Everybody can't be monocolor, so that means people are picking up 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th colors, whatever. And as it's just kind of natural that some of those players are going to go after the same color as you. So you're just not going to be able to get there on volume. So if you have more monocolor spells, if that's where you want to use this extra space, then there's also more room for heavily pipped cards and doing stuff in the monocolor space that is more difficult in a 5-color cube. So depending what you want to do in a color-restricted environment, you can both push decks to be more heavily multicolor, just because it is easier to support multiple players playing the same color combinations, and you can push players to play more in a monocolor space. And depending how you do it, it is totally possible to have an environment where you'll see that blue, 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 the triple pipped card in the same deck as the Grixis card, like something that costs blue, black, red, because every mana fixing land will play to your goal of playing however many colors are in the cube. And you might not like the idea of the mono blue support cards just showing up in the 3-color decks, and you can choose to support just one of these things. You can not go heavier on gold cards, you can try to push more of the monocolor stuff, you could not go heavy on the heavy pipped monocolor stuff and just encourage players to play gold. You get a lot of space to kind of reward players for doing whichever you want to do, and it's totally possible to support both. I like the idea of supporting both the playing all 3 colors or all of the colors in a color restricted environment as well as monocolor, because that gives players kind of more agency. If they draft the mana fixing, they can hybridize the monocolor strategy with the all gold or mini gold card strategy, and that can lead to some cool interactions that you might not have thought of in your design. So I definitely like giving players some agency in that way. This is certainly stuff that you can do one or more or all of these things, because depending on how many colors you restrict and how you execute on that, you do get a lot of space to play with here. Another potential space for a color restriction to open up is that there's more room for colorless cards. This is something that I used heavily in the Grixis Cube when that was on Magic Online. I both had artifacts matter as a significant theme, both for combo and aggro, and even controlling artifact decks, as well as Eldrazi. Given the fact that I didn't need mana fixing lands for green and white, that opens up space for a number of colorless lands that makes it so you can cast Thought-Knot Seer. And you just get to have the volume of Steel Overseer. You can confidently put a card that cares about a high volume of artifacts, even specifically artifact creatures, when you don't have to worry about making sure there's enough going on with Llanowar Elves and friends. You just get more space there. So it's really easy to make artifacts matter in a color restriction. I was previously talking about how green doesn't really play ball with artifacts, and then the absence of green is also just meaningful because you get more space to include more artifacts as well. And then something a little bit more abstract, color restrictions give you more room to support parasitic archetypes. So parasitic archetypes just generally refers to some selection of cards that play specifically in one way that don't play great with cards doing other things. A classic example of a parasitic archetype is poison. Creatures with toxic or infect, I guess specifically infect, toxic can play okay with creatures that only care about regular combat damage, but creatures with infect only deal damage to players in the form of poison counters, so it's really tough to have infect supported in a cube that has a lot of creatures that just don't have it. Your opponent is functionally just going to have higher thresholds of poison counters and life total when not all of your cards are working towards the same goals. There's less extreme examples of this. A good one is talking about creature type matters, typal synergies. Typal synergies can be a little bit tough because so many of like the lords. Let's talk about the card Lord of Atlantis. This is actually a really good example of a card that plays way better in a color restricted cube. It's double pipped, so that's something you open up space for if you don't have to support all of the colors. It's just kind of easier to have more pips of the same color. And then with a card like Lord of Atlantis, it specifically is going to pump Merfolk. And it's just a 2-mana 2/2 on its own. So it's nothing to write home about. You're really going to want a good volume of Merfolk. But it's usually the case. Merfolk, like, is such a one-note archetype. It's usually just making a lot of creatures that attack and block. There's not a lot to really explore there all the time. Like, how much do you want to play Merfolk over just putting Tarmogoyf in your deck? Like, there's plenty of other creatures that attack and block. But when you're playing in a color restricted space, there's just kind of more room. And Merfolk was a really charming way to do aggressive decks in that mono blue cube. And given that blue blue is just 2 mana for the most part in a mono blue cube, this is something that can really shine in that environment. And you can recontextualize cards in this way. But more generally, if you just have a 5-color cube and you put Lord of Atlantis in there and you want to do Merfolk, then blue starts to be a lot about this one creature type. You're going to want to have a good volume of Merfolk. And then those Merfolk cards, yeah, it's like good to have a counter spell in your Merfolk deck. It's good to have draw spells in your Merfolk deck and bounce spells. But it's just more likely and it's more appealing to players to just combine the individually powerful elements of what's going on there, those draw spells, and putting them in some color that's not forcing them to play 2-mana 2/2s. And this really relates to what I was saying about gold cards. When you can fit more archetypes within any 2-color pair, you can also just have more archetypes in a monocolor selection because there'll be more blue cards. It's not going to be the case. Like, the real problem with parasitic archetypes is you start drafting a color, you identify the color is open, maybe you have a color pair or even a 3-color deck you're drafting, and you either are trying to draft this parasitic archetype and then the Merfolk dry up, or the opposite. You have a deck that you're pretty happy with. Maybe you're playing in a different space. Maybe you're doing like blue-white artifacts matter. And then you keep seeing these weird Merfolk. And they're only good with other Merfolk. And they're just not going to play in your deck at all. At least you would not happily register them. That can be a really dissatisfying experience as a player. But a color restricted environment allows you to put those cards in. And because a broader percentage of your draft pool is going to be playable, that's often what that means, something I haven't said explicitly yet. That means you're going to have more of your sideboard be castable spells, which means there is more space for on-color cards to be unappealing to you. So you can just use that space for more monocolor kind of parasitic cards as well. You can do parasitic gold cards too, whatever you want to do. The whole point is just that there's more space and that parasitic cards and mechanics have more room to breathe. And I don't want to say anything prescriptive about any of those things I just discussed. Gold cards, monocolor cards with heavy pip requirements, parasitic mechanics, colorless cards. You can have as much or as little of any of that you want in a color restricted environment. That is space to play in. Those are things to explore. But now I want to talk about something that I'm going to be a little bit more prescriptive about, that I think that I have some good insights, that I've learned a lot playing these environments, and even more recently I've had some of my thoughts even more strongly reinforced or thought about it even a little bit differently drafting recent cubes. And specifically, I think that being mindful about lands is really important for these color restricted environments, to make them work, to make them fun, and to really explore the space and make use of the restriction. So first, let's talk about mana fixing lands, sticking with the example of Grixis Cube. At first blush, I was thinking that this might be a space where you do get to open up more room, include fewer cards than you would normally have in a 5-color environment. But it's actually the case that you really want about the same volume of mana fixing lands. They just take a little different shape when you're playing with 3 colors versus 5 colors. Because you still, at least when I was designing the Grixis Cube, I wanted people to be able to play the full Grixis. I wanted people to explore the different 2-color combinations. And I was supporting each monocolor, but even then, I wanted people to be able to play the spells they wanted to cast and be able to have that agency in exploring Is there a Grixis version with these mono blue payoffs? Things like that. So just making sure players can cast their spells and just keeping up on volume is actually really important for doing that. So you don't need a hollowed fountain in Grixis Cube because you're not going to have a blue-white player, but what you are going to have is multiple players fighting over your steam vents. So this is a fine space to break singleton. I personally don't do it. I like exploring some more of the weirdo land cycles, and there's a good number of additional cycles that exist now that didn't when the Grixis Cube was on Magic Online. Get into like verges, slow lands, just all kinds of stuff opens up, and you can definitely play in the space. It's less important to talk about which mana fixing lands that you want to use to keep that volume up, and more important to acknowledge that because you're going to have multiple players in the same color combinations, it's going to happen way more often that you're in the same color combination is either of your neighbors drafting, and it'll be correct. Like there's enough blue and red cards to go around. When you're fighting over a color in a 3-color environment, and blue is a third of the pack, it's way different than when blue is 20% of the pack. So there's just more space for players to draft the same color combination. So you do need more lands of the same color combination to enable those players to actually cast the spells that they have drafted. And then I would say comparably importantly, and this is the other thing that I didn't talk about in terms of ways to use that space that opens up by eschewing one or more colors, is that you get more space for utility lands. And that's something that's just kind of cool. Utility lands are really fun. There's not always a lot of space for them in Cube. When you're playing with 5 colors, you can have like 1 or 2. You can get a small number of them. But when they're really interfering with your draftable spells pool, when you have to worry about cards being off color, there's not a ton of space for utility lands. A card like Desolate Lighthouse, for example, it's sweet. Taps for colorless, blue-red 1, you can tap it to draw and then discard a card. But when you also have to make sure you get a lot of blue and red fixing so you can cast your blue and red spells, and this is a land that taps for colorless, it is really difficult to justify drafting it, and for that reason it's difficult to justify having it in a cube list. But once the cube is restricted, when there's nothing to worry about with green and white, then suddenly there's just more space for Desolate Lighthouse, and it becomes more appealing to the average drafter. And where my thoughts on utility lands and color-restricted cubes really crystallized was recently drafting my friend Andy's mono black cube that I was talking about a couple weeks ago. It was the case kind of in the early drafts of that cube where players would draft, and we just drafted the same number of cards as usual. We would draft 3 15s or 5 9s or whatever, so we would draft 45 cards. And then it actually was pretty common that players would play 50 or 60 card decks because you have to cut like 20 cards. It's mono black, the basics are swamps, you get as many swamps as you want, and you can cast every spell in your pool. It's actually pretty difficult to whittle down to 20 cuts. Even if there's clear strongest cards in your pool, clear synergies you're exploring, it's still going to be the case that you have a lot of things you need to remove. So like getting it down to 50 is maybe fine, but it's so different than the typical draft experience. And I know for me, if I get my cube down to 50 and I play against somebody that has a 40 card deck and we end up in a situation where I need to top deck a specific thing and I don't draw it, I'm going to be thinking about the fact that my deck is 25% too large. You know, maybe I think about this stuff more than a lot of people, but rather than bemoan the fact that too many of my cards are playable, quite a problem to have, I know, the creative solution, something that Andy and I had talked a bit about, was just increasing the volume of utility lands. And it's something that's been really cool the way that it has shaped up in the cube. The progression was I first observed that I wanted a lot of utility lands because anything replacement level in my pool I'm not really going to care about. I'm going to have a lot of cuts from my deck. So I want to get like a ballpark of removal spells. So I'm going to prioritize the most efficient removal spells highly and maybe the most synergistic or powerful cards highly. But then for the most part, just try to identify a large swath of the cube as being replacement level, certainly once I figured out my archetype, at which point, or even pack one, pick one, I'm going to value powerful lands very highly. There's not a lot in that cube that I would draft over Mutavault, for example. colorless land, you can turn it into a 2/2 for 1 mana every turn, and it's every creature type, and there's typal synergies in the cube. So given the color restriction, given that all of my cards are always going to be castable, I don't have to worry about mana fixing, a colorless land that does something is a very high pick. So it was the week, I think it was the second time I drafted the cube, where I was taking a bunch of utility lands, and it was really easy to get my deck down to 40, and I won all my matches, and I felt really good about this evaluation. And I was talking to Andy after, and we talked about what utility lands could be added, and I offered some, and he came up with some on his own. And then we were drafting. The next time I drafted it, I remember Mutavault was in the pack, and it was next to a land I had never seen before called Barad-dûr. This is a legendary land from Lord of the Rings that enters tapped unless you control a legendary creature. It taps for black, or for black XX, you can tap it and amass Orcs X, so you make an Orc army that is X large. Activate only if a creature died this turn. And it wasn't clear to me which of those cards I wanted more. I had this card that I would draft over almost anything in the cube, but it was just because conceptually I knew I wanted utility lands. And then there was this land where I really wasn't sure how it would play, but it seemed like it could generate some card advantage. It seemed like it could be a good mana sink. I'm still not 100% sure what the pick was, but because I never played with Barad-dûr, I drafted it over a card that I previously thought was like a very high overall pick in the cube. So just getting more utility lands, getting more stuff that's appealing in that space, and getting players to use more of the cards that they draft in their deck without them playing like 50 or 60 cards and feeling weird about it. I cannot stress enough how much depth utility lands can add to these color restricted environments, and also how much you will feel their absence if you just have players drafting 45 cards, just a normal number of cards, and all or most of their pool is just playable. It gets really stressful and weird to make those cuts, or you play a weird 50 card decks. I gotta say, the experience of having just a good volume of utility lands is so much more fun, and it also gets you to do something you don't get to do in Cube a lot. You get to celebrate those desolate lighthouses. They get to show up and have a cool impact on games. So in my mind, your use of lands in a color-restricted cube is really where you can get a cube go from a pretty fun and cool idea to making it really something special and something that players are going to have a unique and memorable time with. As always, your cube, your rules, you're going to have different preferences, you're going to have different experiences when you sit down to draft your cubes. But when you do draft an environment where players can just play more of the spells they drafted, you could have them draft fewer total cards. That's one way to approach it. But I have two issues with that. One, I like just having a consistent draft experience from draft to draft. You draft 45 cards, it just feels like retail limited. That's really valuable to me in terms of familiarity. But then also, it's less fun to draft fewer cards. I want to draft as many cards as we normally draft because I want to have that many shots to look at cool cards that I want to play with. And utility lands are kind of the freest space that you can do something that this space, that the color restriction really invites you and opens you up to do. So I do encourage you to explore that space. Your mileage may vary. You might not like that as much, but I do strongly endorse having a lot of utility lands in these color restricted cubes. But whatever your reason, if you have a clear aesthetic or mechanical reason why you want to imbalance or restrict colors in your cube, this is all just food for thought on how you want to play in that space. And if your entire thought is, I want to build a mono green cube because I've never seen it done before and I think it could be sweet, what more reason do you need? And that's going to do it for this week. Another shorter one, and I've decided that I feel good about it. I think there's going to be weeks where this is all, a half hour is all that I need for the topic, and I'm going to lean in. That's going to happen sometimes, and there's going to be longer ones too. Later this month, I have my 2025 Cube Year in Review on deck, and I'm hoping to make that a one-parter. It seems kind of silly to do that in two parts, but there's a lot to talk about in terms of 6 major releases in Magic this year. But we'll burn that bridge when we get there. Thank you for taking the time to listen, for liking, commenting, reviewing, sharing, subscribing, whatever you do to support the podcast. Thank you so much, and I will be back next week talking more Cube. Later, gamers.